Hello and welcome to New Frontiers on CCTV International. I'm Ji Xiaojun in Beijing. And today in our program, we're continuing with our major series about Chinese civilization. A little more than 2,000 years ago, at the time of the Qing and Han dynasties, the Chinese nation emerged as a unified political and cultural entity for the first time in history. Well, immediately prior to this, there had been an era of enlightenment. During the Spring and Autumn and Warring States period, various schools of thought, such as Confucianism, Taoism, and Maoism, flourished. Well, several centuries later, there would be another golden age. This coincided with the Wei, Qing, and Northern and Southern dynasties, an era of spectacular prosperity in philosophy and the arts. It was during this period that a number of extraordinary artists emerged, who took such art forms as calligraphy, painting, literature, and sculpting to unprecedented heights.
The second tremendous social change after the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period in Chinese history took place during a time when China was under the rule of the Wei and Jin dynasties and the Northern and Southern dynasties. At this time, ethnic groups in North China merged on a large scale, and much of the culture of the Central Plains was taken to the south by immigrants. For a period of 400 years after the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, the Chinese created a rich legacy for future generations. It was an era of great advance in philosophy and the arts. In the arts in particular, there were breakthroughs in every field. This was also an era that made it possible for the emergence of many people of great talent. On the third day of the third month of the lunar year, in the year AD 353, a great event took place in the history of Chinese arts. On what was a very pleasant day with a perfectly clear sky, 41 men of letters wearing impressive hats and broad sashes sat together at Orchid Pavilion on the outskirts of Shaoxing by the Lanxi River. An exquisitely made wine cup was placed on the water in a creek so it could float downstream, and whenever the cup came to one of the 41 men, he would take it up, drink the wine in it, and compose a poem. This was a special ceremonial drinking party of a type that had been held by Chinese scholars for hundreds of years. The ceremonial part was related to the custom of presenting offerings to water, but for these 41 men of letters, this was every bit as much a spring outing. One of the scholars, 50-year-old Wang Shijie, took up a brush pen and wrote a piece of prose about the gathering itself. The 41 scholars could never have imagined that their gathering that day would become a celebrated part of the history of Chinese art. But Wang Shijie's preface to the Orchid Pavilion collection would go on to become known as the #1 calligraphic work in the running script style of calligraphy. The essay contains 324 Chinese characters in 28 rows, and the strokes in each of the characters are fluent and neat. There are 7 characters that mean no, and 21 characters with the particle zhi. Each one of them has its own particularity, yet overall, in this work of calligraphy, they appear completely compatible with each other overall. The period of the Wei and Jin dynasties was an era in which the art of Chinese calligraphy burgeoned and grew with great strength. The accomplishments of Wang Shijie mark the point at which Chinese calligraphy reached maturity, as well as a peak in the history of this writing art. Wang Shijie was born in the year AD 303 in Langya Prefecture, which is today Linyi in Shandong Province. Toward the end of the Western Jin dynasty, noble families in the Central Plain fled to areas south of the Yangtze River to avoid unending wars. And in the year AD 317, a group of these nobles established the Eastern Jin dynasty in the city of Nanjing, with Sima Rui as emperor. Despite the fact that this dynasty was to be plagued by wars, it would bring forth a multitude of outstanding men of letters, accomplished in every conceivable art. Wang Shizhi, who took the style name Yi Xiao, was from a family that was prominent during the dynasty of the Eastern Jin. His family home had been filled with works of calligraphy which he had studied and learned to appreciate when he was very young. When he was old enough, he made trips away from home to visit famous mountains and rivers around China and copied numerous calligraphic inscriptions he found on stone tablets. Eventually, he mastered the art of calligraphy to the highest level. A comment in the book History of the Jin reads, Wang Shizhi gained a great reputation when he was very young. All the court ministers appreciated his talent. The imperial court appointed him minister of the board of the civil office, but he declined the appointment. Wang Shizhi refused to take this high post not once but several times, but this was feudal China, and a person's value was judged by the official position held and the wealth accumulated. Wang Shizhi's refusal to take the conventional path made him a misfit. In his calligraphic works, Wang Shizhi expresses his unadulterated honesty. They bear no traces of vulgarity, yet fully reveal his thinking about the world. And the spiritual world seen in his works is typical of that aspired to and often attained by men of letters from noble families of the Jin dynasty.
这个时期的士人的精神面貌，呈现出比较独特的状态，我们一般叫做魏晋风度。魏晋风度体现在哲学上，是追问老庄哲学里面的无；在生活形态上，是追求所谓的放；在精神境界上，是寻求所谓的达。那么这一切都体现了魏晋时期士人他在精神上和自我的一种觉醒。
An important activity in the lives of scholars of the Wei Jin time was discussing impractical matters and purely philosophical theories centered on what was known as the learning of mystery, a neo-Taoist doctrine prevalent among scholars in the 3rd and 4th centuries. These discussions were rather like today's forums. Well-educated scholars would gather together in some quiet place to conduct debates on philosophical matters. After the Western Jin dynasty unified China once again, for a certain period the imperial court paid great attention to the development of production, and as part of this, taxes on the common people were greatly reduced. As a result, the country's economy and culture progressed considerably.
Now, the philosophy on which the cultural prosperity during the Wei and Jin period was based was metaphysics, otherwise known as the learning of mystery. In essence, it advocated the Taoism of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Taoism, in fact, was such a powerful influence on intellectuals that it all but eclipsed Confucianism, which had been the orthodox ideology throughout the Han Dynasty.
At the core of the learning of mystery was reinterpretation of the 3 great classical philosophical books, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and the Book of Changes. The 2 greatest Taoists, Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, had advocated the doctrines of nature and man being one, and the oblivion of the outer and inner worlds. During the Jin dynasty, scholars found themselves greatly enlightened by these doctrines, and they passionately debated such issues as the kind of life that could bring happiness to people, whether material satisfaction or the emancipation of the soul was more important, and what constituted the state of perfect morals. They came to the conclusion that the significance of life did not lie in gain or loss at any one time or for one matter, but that it lay in the ease one felt in one's heart and the release of one's true feelings. The learning of mystery stimulated the creative power of Chinese civilization. During the Wei and Jin dynasties, the Chinese culture on the Central Plain that had remained unchanged from the previous Qin and Han dynasties underwent a complete overhaul. All aspects of the culture took on a new outlook. The thinking of every prominent scholar became permeated with ideas from the learning of mystery, and their actions testified to the elegant Wei Jin bearing. In April 1960, while excavating a tomb of the Southern Dynasties period, the Nanjing branch of the Jiangsu Provincial Cultural Relics and Archaeology team found this rubbing of a large brick carving depicting the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. The 7 sages were Ji Kang, Ruanji, Shan Tao, Xiang Xiao, Wang Rong, Liao Ling, and Ruan Xian, and they were representative of those who pursued abstract philosophy and the learning of mystery. Each of these 7 men had a particular moral standing and point of view, and they all agreed on one point, that one's life should not be restrained by dogma, and that people should live the way the earliest human beings had lived, by being self-aware, humane, and honest. In this brick carving, we can see that some of the 7 sages are stripped to the waist and some are dressed in loose shirts with wide sleeves. These scholars were passionate about discussing philosophical matters, and they paid great attention to the cultivation of high morals. Ji Kang, the leader of the 7 sages, was madly in love with music. History books tell us he was well versed in many of the arts, but that he excelled at music and often played the lute and recited poems to entertain himself. Sadly, when he was just 40 years old, Ji Kang was falsely accused and executed. But as the time of his execution approached, the only thing he was worried about was whether his great work of music, Guang Ling San, would be lost to the world.